I am a gravedigger. I do not rob graves. I do not dig graves to bury the dead. I dig up graves to bring the dead back to life. Normal grave diggers dig graves to keep people silent forever. I dig graves so that the dead can rejoin us and can have an honest word or two with us. I don't want to silence the dead or ignore them. I want to pay homage to them, especially writers, illustrators, and artists of all kinds. As gravedigger, I don't have a specialty. I'm not narrow. I'm not a Fachidiot, what the Germans fondly call academics who are too narrow and know only one field in which they are experts, but know nothing about the real world surrounding them. In contrast, I am a dilettante and want to explore whatever I can find that is vital for creating a humane society. I am a child of serendipity. As a student, I was lucky to spend 2 years in West Germany in 1961. Before I left New York, none of my Jewish family and friends would speak to me anymore because I was going to Germany. I was given the silent treatment. In Germany, my young friends were also given the silent treatment by their parents who kept silent about the Nazi period. In turn, my innocent young friends could not talk about the past because their parents were ashamed and mute. I kept quiet and listened to the silence in Germany. Then in all the silence, I found that I had to be a grave digger in Germany. Germany was a mystery to me, still is. When it came to understanding German history, all my friends were silent at first. They were silent about the Nazi past because their parents and relatives were silent, as I was silent about the anti-Semitism and prejudice I experienced in America. But I no longer keep silent. Many German philosophers and critics compelled me to open my big fat mouth. Ernst Bloch, Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Hans Mayer, Max Horkheimer, and Erich Fromm, what some people call the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. They also opened my eyes to the dark, debilitating forces in the world. They were all German Jews who fled the Nazis during the 1930s and dedicated themselves to studying and confronting the causes and effects of ignorance and fascism. I was never the same after Germany. I'm never the same. Like one of my heroes, Ernst Bloch, the pugnacious philosopher of hope, I read everything and write on everything. Comics, children's books, newspapers, journals, novels, plays, poetry, sports, dog books, you name it. I am a flea market junkie. I'm also addicted to old books and antiquarian bookstores. Walter Benjamin, a very overrated German writer of the Frankfurt School, once wrote an essay about collecting books. It was actually rather stupid because as a collector of children's books, he did not understand what it meant to be a gravedigger. Nor did I really until recently. In 2008, the year of my final retirement from the corporate University of Minnesota, my wife issued a declaration. It's me or the books. Either I was to part with all the 10,000 or more books in my private library, or she would leave me. She wanted to downsize. She gave me a week's notice for me to make a decision. Well, at first I was somewhat resistant, but when I started going through the fairy tale and fantasy books from the early 20th century in my collection, books by Christian Berman, Paul Vaillant-Couturier, Charles Godfrey Leland, Heywood Brown, Dorothy Burroughs, Rolf Brandt, Emery Kellen, Lisa Tetzner, Maurice Drouin, Herminia Zermühlen, Berta Lask, etc., etc. Most of these authors unknown today, but were rather prominent in their time. Well, I realized I couldn't get rid of these books. I realized what my new mission and profession was. I was a born-again gravedigger. I decided to found my own small publishing house to waken the dead, talented writers and their unique works that still have relevance today. I called my press Little Mole and Honey Bear. And as you can see from this image, fairy tales are like honey in a jug that I savor while my wife looks on to make sure I devour them. Fortunately, she approves of my diet of fairy tale books. Old, uncanny, and musty fairy tale books are often lonesome and maltreated. They are ignored because they are considered quaint, if not useless, antiques, nice to look at briefly with children, of course, and with a touch of nostalgia. Yet deep down we sense there is something more to the tales than our longing for past idyllic times. We really know deep down that old, uncanny fairy tale books should not sit on bookshelves and be allowed to become musty, nor should collectors and libraries conceal them and boast that they are in special collections or in hidden archives. The dazzling and unfathomable wonder tales want to breathe hope through words and images that wishes and daydreams can actually be realized. We can allow them to do this if we learn to think out of the box. Then we arrive. We arrive in alternative worlds where social justice dominates and dictators are extinguished. It is in the forests of alternative worlds that we are free to determine our own destinies. It is there that tyrants receive their just punishments and people celebrate, not just children who expect a happy end. They want resolution and recovery. They want to discover themselves with the help of the tales. Yet fairy tales are not medicine for the sick world in which we live. They are rather indications and traces of what we lack and what we can become. Their endings are our beginnings. They are literally alternative worlds in which ethics and morals in our so-called real worlds are tested. Now, to those shameful people who think fairy tales are nothing but foolish and trivial stories for the kids, there's no hope. For it is through our imagination and imaginative worlds that we create sound and grounded strategies, not only for survival, but also for the endowment of enlightenment. The tales tell us that we, small people, must learn to be smart to outsmart the villains of this earth. The tales rarely favor nasty kings and queens. They question elitism, They show us how we must open our eyes and cooperate with other humans and animals to survive and bring about a more humane world. Not all fairy tales, however, can shine. Not all fairy tales can enlighten us. In fact, there is no such thing as a standard fairy tale or pure literary or oral genre, even though academics often believe that they can define anything through their theories, categories, and definitions. The only thing we know for certain is that diverse tales emanated thousands of years ago in oral traditions, and they were wondrous shared stories that sought to explain the mysteries and magic of existence, why we are here, and where we are going. Some of the tales were marked by rituals. Some tellers of tales endeavored to gain power through didactic and religious tales, while others questioned the arbitrary canons of tales. They refused to allow the magic existence to be packaged in so-called appropriate and organized belief systems. They questioned the better housekeeping mentality. I'm still amazed by the exhilarating, secular, existential fairy tales told, written, and pictured that compel us to think about the mysteries of life and to question the dominant civilizing process that exploits our talents instead of sharing them. I do not want to exaggerate the importance of fairy tales, nor do I think that they are all relevant or informative. Given the universal commodification of culture, it is a miracle that meaningful fairy tales still exist. What I do believe is that numerous writers, illustrators, translators, and collectors of fairy tales from the past 2 centuries have not been given their due. This is why, ever since 2008, I am spending my so-called retirement years publishing fabulous collections of tales by authors and artists who have purposely used their remarkable talents to confront the forces that have exploited the work and fruits of people who have been tramped upon and overlooked. The small people in fairy tales, which are not really fairy tales, because the fairies gave up on us humans years ago. We are left to ourselves. So I seek refuge in work. I seek help by connecting with friends and people whom I don't know, by publishing books that might shine light on the darkness of our days. It is often fascinating for me to draw connections between all the authors in the fairy tale books, especially those from the 20th century. These are books that I have discovered in libraries, flea markets, bookstores, used bookstores, and internet searches. As soon as I had gathered about 50 of the most unusual and politically relevant fairy tales from my collection of old books, and these books are from diverse cultures, I approached various mainline and academic presses to see if they would support my endeavor to create a series called Forgotten Books, similar to a series that I had already founded with Princeton University Press called Oddly Modern Fairy Tales. But unfortunately, they all thought my project was much too idealistic and too radical. Some editors thought there was actually something a bit wrong with me. They were convinced I was a bit disturbed, obsessed. And, well, maybe I was, and maybe I am. But there was a reason for this, so let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, when the famous scientist Albert Einstein was teaching at Princeton University, a tiny old woman approached him as he was walking home after a class he had just taught. She was schlepping a skinny young boy of about 6 who was dragging his feet. "Mr. Einstein," she called out in a strong Central European accent. "Mr. Einstein, stop your tracks and help me." Einstein was taken aback. He didn't know what to do except stop. "How can I help you?" he responded with a smile as he took out a pipe. "You shouldn't smoke. It will kill you," the old woman said. Again, Einstein was taken aback and he put away his pipe. "Is that better?" "Much better," the old woman said as she drew her timid grandson toward Einstein. "Jakey, stop fiddling and listen to this great man." Now she turned her attention back to Einstein. "Mr. Einstein, I want you should tell me what my grandson must do to become educated like you. I want he should be a great scientist." Einstein didn't hesitate with his reply. "Fairy tales. He should read fairy tales." "All right," the woman replied. "But what then? What should he read after that?" "More fairy tales," Einstein stated bluntly, took out his pipe, and continued walking toward his home. The old woman was silent for a moment, but then she grabbed hold of Jakey's hand and began dragging him through the park again. Suddenly, she stopped. "You heard, Jakey?" She pointed her finger at the frightened boy. "You heard what the great man said? Read fairy tales. Do what the great man said, or God help you." And she then whisked her grandson away. Well, ever since that traumatic experience was something more than I had ever imagined could happen, my grandmother did not stop telling me fairy tales during my childhood, mostly in a Minsk and Yiddish accent. And ever since then, I have been entranced by tales because of the truths they tell. And I think that this was the reason that I had some success in convincing the editors-in-chief at the University of Minnesota Press and then Wayne State University Press in 2017 and 18 to distribute unusual fairy tales from the past. Minnesota did 3 in a row: Tales of Wonder, retelling fairy tales through picture postcards in 2017, Fearless Ivan and His Faithful Horse, Double Hump, in 2018, and Charles Godfrey Leland's The Book of the 100 Riddles of the Fairy Bellaria in 2018. I was particularly invested in Fearless Ivan, which I adapted from a long poem by Pyotr Yashov in 1834. I was drawn to a courageous peasant boy and his clever pony to read how they outwit an old Tsar who is boiled in a pot of boiling milk. And I was even more moved by the 100 Riddles of the Fairy Bellaria, in which a mysterious fairy solves 100 riddles and then causes a vicious king to fall on his own sword because he had colonized and killed thousands of people. There are many ways to deal with cruel dictators, even in books for young people. And I think it's cruel not to expose children to tales about cruelty, for we learn all about kindness and dignity through its opposite. Leland makes this clear at the end of his book. Thus were the 100 riddles made, which in this book you now have read. Many may deem them trifling things, great, yet practice in them ever brings great quickness to the youthful mind, as all may soon by trial find. Those who soon trace a riddle out are quick or solving at any doubt. And many a thing is taught in schools, not half so good for curing fools as riddling is. The thing is true. The same year, 2018, that I published Leland's Bellaria book, I decided to move the distribution of Little Mole and Honey Bear to Wayne State University Press, which promised to allow me to publish as many books as I wished, so long as I could finance them, and then the press would distribute these books. And indeed, I had two fascinating books ready for publication in 2019 and 2020. Christian Beermann's The Giant Owl and Tiny Tim, Der Riese Owl und das Hanesle, and Paul Vaillant-Couturier's Johnny Breadless, a pacifist fairy tale, Jean Sans Pain. Both of these books were published right after World War I and deal with young boys who lose their parents and must learn how to survive by themselves. In Johnny Breadless, a large magical rabbit has compassion for the orphan boy and uses his huge ears as propellers to form an airplane with pheasants and to fly to different places during World War I. At each stop, a factory where workers are worked to the bone, a luxurious dinner for wealthy people, and the war front with soldiers killing each other. The rabbit helps educate Johnny about the causes of all wars so that he can combat inequality and injustice. The provocative illustrations by the gifted surrealist painter Jean Loca compel readers, I think, to contemplate the devastation of war. Later, in 1933, Vaillant-Couturier, one of the founders of the French Communist Party, who is today not very well known, he wrote a book with the title Le malheur d'être jeune, the misfortune of being young, in which he stated, and I'm quoting from his book, before the war, to be young meant to have a full life ahead of oneself. During the war, to be young meant to have death ahead of oneself. Today, to be young means to have a miserable life ahead of oneself. Certain older people keep telling the young, you're lucky to be young. Well, not really. To be young today means to have the misfortune of being young. Well, this is horrific. This goes against nature. That's evident. But that's how things are. Why? It is this persistent question, why, that we all ask, not just children, throughout our lives. Why are we here? Why do we live the way we live? Why do people starve? Why can't we change the world for the better? There is also a why question underlining Beermann's The Giant Owl and Tiny Tim, which also has startling images depicting the dilemma of the giant, an orphan boy, and a town called Haida. Once upon a time, that could be any time, a lonely, humongous giant named Owl, and don't ask me why he was named Owl, was so lonely living in solitude on top of a mountain that he decided to seek friendship in a town below. However, once this enormous giant appeared, he horrified the people who closed their doors and basically made it clear to him that he was not wanted. Well, poor old the refugee, the immigrant, who would not harm a flea, left the town in despair. And he spent the night in a wheat field far from the town. In the morning, however, a young boy named Tiny Tim, and don't ask me why he was named Tiny Tim, stood over him and yelled that he was damaging the wheat. Despite the fact that Tiny Tim was only 10 years old, he was fearless and ordered the humongous giant to leave. However, the boy was surprised. Ole begged him to let him stay. He promised he would help in the fields and do any kind of work to keep the farm in shape. Since Tiny Tim had lost his parents and had to look after his younger brother and sister, he accepted. And in the next months, Ole cleaned up the farm and fields and made friends with all the children in the region. Soon, however, the town was attacked by 3 nasty troublemakers from the underworld. And the townspeople, despite their fear of Ole, had to turn to him and Tiny Tim for help. And sure enough, the boy and the giant got rid of the vermin. Ole and Tiny Tim became heroes in the entire region. Yet as we know particularly today, life on earth is unpredictable. And all of a sudden, joy turned to grief in the town of Haida. An ugly virus arrived, indeed, death himself. A gaunt, wretched giant started killing everyone with this poison. It seemed that nobody would survive the epidemic. However, once death announced that it was going to infect Tiny Tim, the giant Ole could not bear the thought of this. After all, Tiny Tim was a true friend. The townspeople had accepted him into their community. Everyone loved him, and indeed the giant loved them, and Tiny Tim most of all. So he challenged death to a battle. Whoever would win the battle would decide Tiny Tim's fate, as well as the fate of the town of Haida. Well, this battle raged for 1 whole week, and in the end, death has to promise Ole he would retreat and not touch the hair of any single person in the town. Well, you can imagine what happened in the town of Haida. You can imagine the celebration in this small town named Haida. And don't ask me why the town was named Haida. I could actually ask now why Christian Beermann and his tales have been forgotten. He also wrote about some other giants and was in his prime at 45 years when he died. Both Beermann and Vaillant Couturier died relatively young. Fortunately, this is not the case with some other writers and illustrators I have discovered and published. They've lived much longer. Given the discord in America and other countries in the world, and given the fact that fascism has raised its ugly head again, I decided that Little Mole and Honey Bear had to speak out, truth against power, although I know that there is no such thing as an absolute truth. In fact, I believe that the only way young people and adults as well can discover and determine truth is by confronting the lies of fascist creatures like those who crawl out of dark holes and mock humanity. Consequently, I decided to publish two unusual picture books this past fall, Kiro the Great and All That You Want to Know About Fascism, written by Deirdre and William Councilman and illustrated by Fred Fox. And the other book is Yusuf the Ostrich by Emery Kellen. My decision to do this was not to clear my conscience for not taking a more active role in fighting fascism in the United States, nor do I believe that these books will change people's minds about how to deal with negative political conditions in my country, or any country for that matter. However, I strongly believe that these books are in keeping with Ernst Bloch's philosophy of hope. Hope makes itself felt as a longing and desire in people to change the world because the world is incomplete. It lacks substance and vitality and is full of lies and misinformation. In fact, the world needs to be recreated through art and compassion. And throughout his life, Ernst Bloch endeavored to transform himself and others into hopeful magicians, dedicated to change the conditions under which we live. That is, to propose and provoke a new way of living. Simply put, Bloch was a dreamer of a possible new life. And his magnus opus, The Principle of Hope, Das Prinzip Hoffnung, clarifies just how significant daydreams are for hope. I want to quote a passage from his book. Everyone's life is pervaded by daydreams, and one part of this is just stale, even enervating, escapism, even booty for swindlers. But another part is provocative, is not content just to accept the bad which exists, does not accept renunciation. This other part has hoping at its core and is teachable. It can be extricated from the unregulated daydream and from its sly misuse, keeping them trained unerringly, usefully, on what is right, can be activated undimmed. Nobody has ever lived without daydreams, but it is a question of knowing them deeper and deeper, and in this way, keeping them trained unerringly, usefully, on what is right. Let the daydreams grow really fuller, that is clearer, less random, more familiar, more clearly understood, and more mediated with the course of things, so that the wheat which is trying to ripen can be encouraged to grow and be harvested. Bloch's mission in life was to teach and realize hope, to be a practitioner of hope. And there was not a single genre of art analyzed by him that did not provide hope for people. In short, the publication of my recent books, such as The Magical Fairy Tales of Charles Godfrey Leland, stories he collected from witches, Roma, and indigenous people, and the books to come, can be considered gestures of hope that through the revival of old fairy tale books, born out of struggle, I can make some sort of contribution to build a world filled with compassion and social justice. Certainly, that is the message in Yusuf the Ostrich. The author and illustrator of this work, Emery Kellen, was a brilliant political Hungarian caricaturist who, after fighting in World War I and working for the League of Nations in the 1920s, fled the Nazis in 1938 and landed in New York, where he worked for the United Nations. At the same time, he wrote and illustrated a few children's books with a wry humor, an acute sense of the absurd. Yusuf the ostrich is born during World War II in Northern Africa, and once he discovers that he has a great talent as the fastest runner in the region, he works for the Allied forces to defeat the Nazis. However, he is captured by the Germans, and then he needs the help of two little dachshunds and returns to safety. Yet he is not interested in medals. He simply wants peace and to join and love his mother. What else can I say about this hopeful book except to talk about its companion, Kedal the Great, which has a much different tone than Yusuf. Narrated by two young Americans and illustrated by a friend of their father, Kedal exposes the authoritarian machinations of a creep and how he developed into a full-blown likeness of Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and other psychotic leaders roaming the world today. The only way to get rid of them, this story indicates, is not through violent means of war, but through laughter. It is laughter that can puncture the bombacity of fascism. And you must read and view this book to understand how its joyful message can be transmitted to young people from dead authors and illustrators. As I stated at the beginning of my talk, I am a gravedigger, a dilettante, a daydreamer, who looks for traces of hope in old fairy tale books that are not so antiquated as we think. Once we open our eyes to the past, we may find our way to a better future than the one which is threatening us in the name of fascism. Thank you.
Thanks very much for watching our film. We will be back in 5 minutes for a Q&A, a live Q&A with Professor Jack Zipes. Welcome to Miscellaneous Productions, Resurrecting Dead Fairy Tales, an online lecture and Q&A with renowned fairy tale and folklorist Jack Zipes. Before we begin the Q&A, let us take a moment to please acknowledge where we are. Miscellaneous Productions is presenting this event today on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded, that means stolen, territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It is an honor to present children's literature, rigorous and informed dialogue, theater, dance, music, and performance art on their lands and the lands of their ancestors. Their cultures have left a lasting legacy for us to learn from and to cherish. We work and live on unceded, stolen Coast Salish territories. We endeavor to honor the land and its treaties by strengthening our relationship and responsibility to Coast Salish people and all Indigenous people across Turtle Island. The presence of settlers, non-Indigenous peoples who live on stolen and unceded lands is not neutral. It has continues to have devastating impacts on the many aspects of life, art, and culture for Indigenous people. Settler colonialism has suppressed and harmed Coast Salish people, whether they be land-based or of the sea and sky. We hold this understanding in our interactions and engagements in this land and its people. Those of us who are settlers need to recognize that our knowledge and way of doing things may not be a priority as we work towards equality for everyone in the region. Because we are gathering in a digital space, we would like to encourage and invite everyone to take a moment and reflect upon the land you are on and your relationship to it and how it looks as you acknowledge your ancestry. We would like to humbly thank and honor Coast Salish people for stewarding the land we occupy, which has been territory, land, sea, and sky from which our artistic community has grown. My name is Elaine Carroll, and I'm the Artistic Director of Miscellaneous Productions, director and producer of this new film and event with Professor Jack Zipes. On behalf of our staff, board, and young performers, I would like to thank you so much for attending this presentation. It means a lot to us. We would especially like to thank our dear funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Arts Council, BC Gaming, City of Vancouver Arts and Culture, Vancouver Foundation, and many generous individuals. We would like to thank our main community partner, the Dance Center. Thanks so much for the exceptionally talented people working behind the scenes, including our volunteer board of directors and fantastic professional team. At Miscellaneous Productions, we believe all youth have a right to the highest quality, comprehensive professional training in the performing arts, regardless of cultural background, income level, or experience. And now I would like to introduce our community support worker, Alex Denard, who will present our group agreement for the evening.
Thank you so much, Elaine. We ask that all of you participating in today's event respect our anti-harassment policy. We request that all attendees refrain from harassment of any sort, including, but not limited to, visuals or images of any kind, language, comments, or questions that are of a racist, homophobic, sexist, sexual, or threatening nature. This includes actions that disrupt or interfere in any way with other attendees or presenters' ability to participate. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind and will immediately disconnect and block any offenders from the event.
Thank you so much, Alex. We really appreciate that. I would like to introduce the great Jack Zipes right now. He is a professor emeritus of German cultural studies, critical theory, and comparative literature, and is the translator of two major editions of the Tales of the Brothers Grimm. His work focuses on the evolution of fairy tales and their social and political role in the civilizing process. With arguments based on the Frankfurt School, and more recently, theories of cultural revolution, he maintains that fairy tales serve a meaningful social function, not just for compensation, but for revelation. The worlds projected by the best of our fairy tale reveal the gaps between truth and falsehood in our immediate society. Zipes founded his own publishing house, Little Mole and Honey Bear, to bring back in print works from the 1920s to the 1950s that have been neglected in favor of flashier commercial projects, breathing life into older fairy tales that deliver messages important to these very complicated fascistic times that we live in. In addition to his deep knowledge of fairy tales and folklore, Professor Zipes will bring to his work with Miscellaneous Productions an internationally recognized co-creator of Neighborhood Bridges, a community-engaged theater program that uses storytelling and theater to help children develop their critical and storytelling skills. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jack Zipes. How you doing tonight, Jack?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful introduction.
You're welcome. We're going to begin with questions very soon. And here's the first one. I'm just getting into the study of folklore and fairy tales. There is such a wealth of resources. Where do you recommend that I start? what advice would you give to scholars who are studying folklore and fairy tales?
Uh, the first step that I would take would be to inquire where folklore is being taught at either high schools or universities. And I would also suggest that you get into touch with certain groups, folklore societies. In most states have these folklore societies, and that's the first step that I would take. And then, of course, when you get to uh, attend the university, I certainly would try to find out a university that has a good folklore program.
Thanks, Jack. Um, the next question is, as a mother of young children, what fairy tales would you recommend exposing them to? I find the originals to be very dark, which is fine for me, but I'm curious about what you think about books and literature for younger children.
Oh, I really don't think you should be afraid to expose your children or child to any of the tales. They're all, whether they end darkly or have terrible conflicts in them. I think that the only way that a child will learn about kindness, generosity, compassion is if they learn how evil the world can be.
Thanks, Jack. Beautiful answer. How can we make the people who think fairy tales are foolish come to the realization that fairy tales are actually expose what we are and what we can become?
uh, I'm not too sure we can do that. If people have a particular, say, prejudice against fairy tales or think that they are lightweight and so on and so forth, then it's very difficult to change their taste or their attitudes toward fairy tales. Uh, However, that being said, the more sophisticated, unusual, out of the box fairy tale films, operas, musicals, books, stories, and so on, I think would be the first step that that person should take in order to understand how significant fairy tales are today.
Thanks, Jack. That's a beautiful answer. We have another question here. Has there ever been a time when you had to find your way back to fairy tales? And if you did, which stories were gateways back to wonder and reading wonder tales for you?
I really have never had that problem. I think that ever since I was a child, I was open to all kinds of fairy tales. So I've never, I would say that fairy tales have really provided me with a hope that we can deal with abominable kings and queens and witches. And, uh, it's, we have that problem in reality. We've had an abominable president in the United States. And my only hope was that we could get rid of him, and we have.
I have another question here for you, Jack. Does the way the townspeople only accept the giant owl after he helps save them suggest an attitude about the necessity for refugees and immigrants to prove their usefulness to society? An attitude we see a lot of today to society's detriment.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a lot of racism and prejudice in all societies. And so the immigrant or the person who comes into a particular society is put to a test. And that is, as I said, unfortunate that this must happen. I think anybody who comes into a new society has to expect that people are going to have prejudiced views, and you're going to have to learn how to deal with them. And at a certain point, if you do prove yourself, I think that the welcome will be very, very great. On the other hand, I think that we all have to practice uh, a great deal of compassion for people who enter our society and who are flustered at first and have prejudice against them. And I think that we have to be more open to people who come from other societies.
Thank you, Jack. Here's another question. These stories are from a tradition of being read and being told. Have you seen any theater performances of fairy tales that succeeded as staged adaptations? If so, what were some of the qualities of the staging that you felt made it effective in that particular medium of live theater?
Well, I really can't recall right now, so I can't answer that question. Sorry.
There is a wealth of theater out there that explores fairy tales and folklore. And I think in the next little while, we're going to see more of that. So I do believe that there are some good examples out there, but they might not be, Broadway shows. They might be shows coming from community engaged arts organizations, more community-based organizations, smaller theater companies that are really stretching the meaning of fairy tales. They definitely exist. And what we can do is I can put together a little resource later on our Facebook page for that. Okay. Here's another question for Jack. What is your favorite personal fairy tale? What lessons can be learned and taught in real life from your favorite fairy tale or favorite fairy tales?
Yeah, that question is always somewhat difficult because I do love many different fairy tales, literary fairy tales, oral folk tales, and so on. But the one tale that I love the most is how six made their way through the world. And it's all about a tale about a king who maltreats a peasant after the peasant has served in the army for about 10 or 20 years and only gets 2 pence when he retires from the army. And the soldier then says, I'm going to get revenge. I really feel that this is dishonest. And the king almost has the peasant killed, but the peasant runs off and in the forest meets a strong man carrying about 3 or 4 trees for his grandmother so he can chop the trees up and make wood for her. And he's astonished that he's carrying these oak trees on his back and asks him and says to him, I could use somebody like you. Could you come along with me? And then he says yes. And then there are 5 other super sort of heroes. One is the fastest man in the world. Another can swallow rivers. Another can shoot an animal about 5 or 10 miles away. And all of these superheroes join with this peasant who used to be a soldier, and they hear about a race that the king, who had maltreated this peasant, this ex-soldier, uh, and this king has said, anybody who can beat my daughter in a race can have her for his wife. But if he doesn't, his head will be chopped off. And so the ex-soldier goes to the king. The king doesn't recognize him. And he says, I would like to endeavor to beat your daughter in a race, but I have 5 friends who are with me and I'd like them to participate with me. And the king says, oh, yeah, of course you can try to beat my daughter, but you won't win. So the race begins the next day, and of course the six young men defeat the princess, and the princess still refuses to marry the peasant soldier, and the king tries to have the peasant soldier and his friends murdered one night, but they survive that, and they threaten to take over the entire kingdom. But the king says, okay, I will let you take a small amount, whatever you can carry out. And they can, because they're so strong and so unusual, they carry the entire wealth of the kingdom with them, and then they move off, and the king sends his soldiers after them, and they blow these soldiers into the air, and the one of the captains returns to the king and says, there's nothing we can do there. They're too strong for us. We've tried everything, and we'll die if we try anything more. And off the six go, and they share all their wealth with one another and all their relatives. And I love that tale because it's a rebellion against the way we actually treat soldiers today. They are generally from the lower classes. They are generally maltreated. They're generally exploited. And it's the friendship. The soldiers, ex-soldiers, come to a realization that there should be no kings in the world, and we should be able to share everything that we do together. It's my interpretation, of course, which I just told you orally, but it's a tale that's widespread throughout the world because the conditions throughout the world are very similar.
Thanks, Jack. Here's a question. There's a couple of questions coming up that talk about old and new, and I'll give you the first question. How do you feel about podcasts reviving the old tradition of old and sometimes lost fairy tales?
Oh, I strongly support that movement. I think that there are too many people expect fairy tales to be very flashy today and so on and so forth, but they're missing out on a tradition that goes way back thousands of years. Well, not thousands, but hundreds of years at least. And these tales that from the past are extremely interesting and still are relevant for today's world.
Thank you. Great answer. And that's been, I can see already some podcasters just cheering you on here. So that's fantastic. What do you think about the revival, retelling, rewriting of fairy tales versus the creation of completely new fairy tales? Is one more important than the other when you talk about fairy tales today?
No, I think they're related. I think that the revival, and I have nothing against new fairy tales and this type of revival is a way that we can continue the traditions that are very significant in most countries. And so the more that we have both at the same time, a revival and new tales coming into being due to the revival, I think it's wonderful to hear sort of a renaissance of storytelling in the world. And I think a lot of that comes due to the fact that there has been a lack of communication, a lack of sharing wonderful stories that we should all know from different cultures.
Thanks, Jack. Here's another question. Aside from reading the fairy tales themselves, and aside from reading the work of Jack Zipes, are there any other scholars, academics, or philosophers you would recommend for interested readers?
I think whoever asked that question should send me an email. There are tons of really good scholars, particularly young scholars who are entering into the field. They're superb and they have unique approaches to the tales. The one thing that I would stress is that the scholars who are writing about fairy tales today are strongly interested in feminism, strongly interested in causes of racism, strongly interested in causes of war, very, very interested in environment and animals. In particular, there are some superb scholars who are doing great work on the animals who appear in fairy tales and what happens to them.
Thank you. Here's another question. The questions are just flying in. What is your recollection, if any, of your, from your perspective, what is your recollection, if any, of your childhood encounter with Albert Einstein?
You know, my recollection is very hazy, but something occurred, and so I've told this tale for a long time, and I know that it occurred. It may not have occurred the way that I tell the tale, but it did occur.
Thanks. Here's a question I really like. How do we deal with the apparently anti-feminist element of certain fairy tales that cast witches, elderly solitary women, as the quote unquote evil characters?
Well, you know, there's nothing that we can do about this. I mean, these characters have been created by very good storytellers. To a great extent, a lot of these characters or negative characters we think are negative were really created by the Christian church. And because the Christian church was afraid that people who originally believed more in women who were herb gatherers and actually like doctors, they were afraid that they were too powerful. And so they had to create anti-feminist tales. They had to transform women into witches and other characters like that. So we have to know the socio-historical context of the negative and positive characters and who created them, and how these, for instance, how there's been sort of a reversal in the 1970s with, I think, the wave of feminism. A lot of women began calling themselves purposely witches in order to subvert this notion that all witches are negative. So there's been some very unusual reversals that have happened because of the fact that we've exposed that the church is actually very guilty with regard to how they treat children and how they take advantage of children. It's not women who do that, it's the church.
Thanks, Jack. And I'll tell you something, after traveling in Spain and doing some research there, there was a big break after the Catholic kings took over that particular country, and it really affected their fairy tales and folklore. And especially in the more, in places like Catalonia and certain pockets of Andalusia, where there were the strong anarchist movement, there's definitely a readaptation of those ancient fairy tales, and it's just incredible to be there. Here's a new question for you. Do you feel that new adaptations to fairy tales with a modern twist will be necessary? What ways do you think we can entice people to fairy tales given today's ever increasing digital world?
Well, I think the fairy tales are spreading despite what's happening today. There's been a tremendous growth in the interest in all types of fairy tales, particularly modern fairy tales that deal with the constant problems that we have. So I'm not worried. Well, I am worried about one thing, that people are reading less and less, and their eyes are glued more to screens of all kinds. And that's a shame, because there have been a remarkable, there's been a remarkable wave, particularly of women writers who address questions that deal with sexism and deal with the abuse of children. So I do think that we should take care that we don't do away with purchasing books for children that are really interesting books, and also provocative, and demand that we give a great deal of thought to what we are reading. The difficulty today is that most of children's literature is garbage. I would say 80% to 90% that of the books and toys that have been produced are there just to, let us say, uh, give them a thrill or to some sort of enjoyment or escapism. Really good fairy tales, really good literature for children is very difficult to find. You really have to do some work, and I think it's up to parents to do their work so that their children can really move away from screens, move into books, move into plays, move into music, and do things that also activate them instead of allowing their children to sit on their rear ends and play these stupid games.
Thanks, Jack. I can see the mothers in the crowd having a good smile on their face on that one. Um, while you've unearthed many great fairy tales, how do you recommend we continue to foster more grave diggers like you?
I think there are other grave diggers out there. Maybe I should form a grave digger society. I think that's what I should be doing. And maybe through the books that I'll be publishing, maybe that will happen. I'm not too sure.
Thanks, Jack. Here's another question. Talking about being young, it seems that youth are in a dire predicament. Do you acknowledge the darkness that will eventually lead to hope? How do fairy tales fit into that process? That's an excellent question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's no doubt that we're living in a dark period, really dark period. I mean, there is no more democracy in the United States. It's a type of oligarchy. And I think the first step that we have to do uh, as educators or just as adults is to recognize all the mistakes that have recently been made in the past 4 years or longer, and to prevent the types of, I would say, uh, types of actions, types of behavior that I would call fascist or soft fascism, because unless we begin to recognize that equality and fairness and justice does not exist, and that we must create new forms that allow justice and equality and all forms of sharing to develop so that there are no homeless people, there are no people who have been abused, and or no people who are sitting on borders dying and being separated from families. So there's a lot of work that we have to do. And to a great extent, fairy tales or good fairy tales, what I call good fairy tales, really enable us to have the hope that we can accomplish a lot of the things that I think we should be doing.
Thank you, Jack. Here's another question. Is one of your hopes to encourage emerging and new writers and illustrators of children's books to explore issues of fascism, totalitarianism, and bullying on an international level?
Yes, that's one of my hopes. There are wonderful, wonderful artists out there, painters, um, artists of different kinds, theater people, singers, you name it. Uh, the question is, how do we support these people? Most of these people are having difficulty earning a living. And so we have to find those people in the arts who really want to want to dedicate themselves to enabling children to grow and to live lives of their own choices. This is our task. Our task is not to have a society in which, as I mentioned in my talk, where to be young today, uh, to be young today is dangerous. To be young today means watching out, to live with anxiety. This is not what youth should be about. And this is all that youth is mainly about all over the world.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And yes, we have, even before the pandemic, we have noticed that the anxiety levels of children and youth have risen to just disproportionate levels. And for teachers, frontline workers, youth workers, child and youth and family workers, it's been a very, very difficult time during the pandemic because the anxiety levels of all of us are very high, but they're particularly high in children and youth. So thank you for that answer. I just want to go back here. There's a question. What do you think should be a canon, a good canon for children's literature? What should that be composed of? Can you give us an example of 3 good books?
Again, that's a question that whoever wrote that question should contact me, and I'd be glad to send a list and so on. I don't believe in canons. I think that the slightest tale can be maybe 2 or 3 lines long, or it might be a book, or there were many, as I said, amazing amount of gifted writers, and there were very good anthologies out there. And I can definitely give advice and suggest that this person try to obtain this or that anthology. But there's enough material out there that one can form one's own sort of curriculum. In the work that I've done in schools in the United States, we've always tried to establish a type of curriculum that is related to the lives that that the young people lead. So in other words, we don't want to impose a canon on a particular group of people or children. We want that so-called canon or collection of tales to come from them, and so that we can then work with those tales.
Thanks, Jack. Here's a new question. What do you think about the happily ever after at the end of fairy tales? Is a version of our modern positive resolution to a conflict, or is it more, perhaps hope?
The end of all tales, of happily ending tales, we know is just the beginning of something new. In other words, we really should realize as much as possible, because not all tales end that way, by the way. But when they do end that way, and there's a marriage of some kind, that's when the trouble begins, so to speak. Because so that the happy ending with a wedding is really not an ending. It's a beginning of how do you relate to one another? What has happened? Who do you really know each other? And so on and so forth. So it's just a tentative ending, I would say. And so one has to be, I think, aware of the fact that nobody lives happily ever after. We live with a lot of problems, a lot of interesting problems, nothing to get upset about, but that's just the way life is.
Thanks, Jack. When do stories become fairy tales? How do stories that we tell today traverse to that realm? Sorry.
Again, that is a question that demands a long, long answer. The history of, you might know that there are very few fairies in fairy tales. And the term developed in the 1690s by a brilliant writer, Madame d'Aulnoy, an aristocratic woman, who gave one of the books the title Conte de Fées, Tale of Fairies, and it caught on. This was in the 1690s, but not all of the tales were filled with these fairies, and it's an interesting to study how and why she invented that term, why a lot of the women decided to call themselves fairies. And again, it's the whole question was a resistance to the church. And because these fairies were more powerful than the Christian God and all the saints and so on and so forth. So it's a very complicated story that I've told in a few of my books.
Thanks, Jack. Here's another question. How can we best and most usefully support you and your publishing house, Little Mole and Honey Bear?
Oh, I, I think I should have brought a pan with me to catch all the money that I'll need. No, I'm just kidding. I think that I have to fend for myself. I have to find ways to make these books known, these authors, dead authors, and artists. So it's my problem, and I'll try to solve it as best I can.
Well, we do know that your books are selling out fast because I know that you had run out of some books as we were preparing to make the film. And then when I tried to order them from independent booksellers, they were all sold out. So I had to unfortunately go to the evil Amazon to order a couple of books that you had run out of and all the independents had run out of. So we do hope that there's some way that you can fund a second run. I have another question here. And it segues from what you've been saying. In the film lecture, you state the fairies gave up on us a long time ago. So can you please elaborate on that? And you also talk about how their endings are our beginnings. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes. Well, I have a feeling that we have been blessed with what I call fairies, that we've been blessed by people, unusual, particularly women, and that these women have tried to infuse our lives with a great deal of compassion and understanding for one another, and that they have wanted a world that is much less antagonistic and divided than the world that we have today. And so I think that these fairies have, to a certain extent, given up on us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had such an abominable president here in the United States like Mr. Trump. Uh, that how can we possibly justify what has happened in the United States, at least, and in other countries in the world in the last 4 or 5 years, and it continues to go on. So the fairies have tried their best to, in I would say, to introduce us to possible ways that we can lead a much fairer life. And so they're frustrated. They've left, and we have to now create our own fairies instead of creating dictators, which we've been doing in the last 20 years or so.
Thanks, Jack. Here's one last question, Jack. Do you think further study on fairy tales harms or improves upon the didactic message? Or would you rather fairy tales be consumed as a contemporary culture and each individual take from them what they require?
No, I'm very much for the study of fairy tales, and I think that they're much richer and more complex, more varied, diverse than one realizes. And I think that the study of fairy tales is very beneficial to all societies. And I think that we have to get away from the perversion of fairy tales by corporations like the Walt Disney Corporation, which really has destroyed fairy tales more than actually enabling fairy tales from really what I call unique fairy tales from developing. The Walt Disney Corporation has basically homogenized fairy tales so that really people today have no idea what a true, unusual, unique, beneficial fairy tale is. And a lot of that is due to the fact that the Disney Corporation has just tried to make money off the tales rather than trying to develop unusual tales that we all need.
Thanks, Jack. That was a fantastic series of questions and answers. Thank you so much. And thanks so much to our beautiful audience. Thank you so much to Jack. Thank you so much to our fabulous professional team, our board of directors, our funders, and all of our volunteers and the youth we collaborate with from throughout Canada and Europe. I'm going to take just a quick break here while we switch into talking about what's coming up for Miscellaneous Productions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, it was an honor, really. We have a full season of digital programming, all arts related, mostly geared to youth and emerging artists, and all free. On February 26th, we will be celebrating our 20th anniversary 20.5. Miscellaneous Productions will present the world premiere of Away with Home, a professionally produced 57-minute video of the live community engaged co-creation performance at the Dance Center in October 2019, and a live Q&A with the fabulous young cast members. In March, we will be launching 2 new excellent online projects for youth and emerging artists: Film for Beginners with Anne-Marie Fleming, and Music 101 with Tanya Aganaba, Robin Lane, and Jaya Story. We will also be launching a fabulous new program in March for youth from age 9 and older, Distance Hats, another series of fun-filled free workshops conducted as part of the creation of Miscellaneous Productions' upcoming theater work Plague, and that will be produced in 2022-2023. The project begins with the distribution of 200 art kits to representative groups throughout British Columbia. Participating youth will engage via Zoom with professional artists to create imaginative big hats, each relating to the youth's interpretation of fairy tales and folklore from their own cultures and from their imaginations. For more information, check out our Facebook page, our Instagram, our Twitter account at Miss Community, our Facebook page you're on right now, and our website, www.miscellaneousproductions.ca. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, professionals. Thank you, lovely audience.